inferno consumes the home of a Staten Island family on Christmas night, 1843. The bodies of a young mother and her baby are found amongst the wreckage. But it very soon becomes clear that they did not meet their ends by fire. Welcome back to Victorian True Crime. Today, we're talking about the Witch of Staten Island. In 1843, Graniteville was a small rural Staten Island community predominantly made up of quarry miners, oystermen, and other seafaring folk. Among its most prominent residents were the Housemans. In addition to his own profitable oyster fleet, the family patriarch Abraham Houseman owned much of the rock-rich land that gave the neighborhood its name, and had made a small fortune leasing this out to local quarrymen. Though a widower by 1843, Abraham lived close to the rest of his family. His daughter, Polly Bodine, had recently moved back into the family home with her children after separating from her husband, and his son, George Houseman, lived right across the street, along with his wife Emmeline and their 18-month-old daughter, Anne Eliza. George was a sea captain, which often required him to be away for extended periods of time, as was the case that Christmas season of 1843. In his absence, the Housemans kept an eye on George's wife and baby, with either Polly or Polly's teenage daughter Eliza often staying the night with Emmeline to keep her company. After staying with her sister-in-law for much of that week leading up to the holiday, Polly left Emmeline's place on the morning of Christmas Eve, returning to her father's house across the street to prepare for a trip to Manhattan. Throughout the day, neighbors observed Emmeline in and around the house, doing chores, running errands, playing with the baby, etc. Later that evening, Polly's daughter Eliza dropped by her aunt's house to ask Emmeline if she'd like someone to spend the night, but Eliza's knocks at the door went unanswered. Concerned, Eliza returned home to tell her mother, but Polly assured her that Emmeline had likely just gone to spend Christmas with her own family, the Van Pelts, and the matter was left at that. The house across the street was still and silent when Christmas morning dawned, and continued so for the rest of the day. Hours later, the quiet calm of the night was shattered by the shriek of fire alarms and the horrified cries of neighbors as George and Emmeline's house burst into flames. The fire was quickly extinguished, and when the smoke cleared, those first on the scene were able to inspect the devastation. The house had been ransacked, disordered not by fire, but by apparent burglary. And there, amidst the rubble, were the remains of Emmeline and baby Anne, their bodies badly burned, though not enough to obscure one very notable discrepancy. The heads of both victims were badly bludgeoned, their skulls fractured. Mother and daughter were not victims of a tragic fire. They had been brutally murdered, likely well before the fire was set. But who would do such a thing to a young mother and an 18-month-old child? As investigators were quick to realize, the Housemans seemed to have no enemies to speak of. Aside from being from such an illustrious local family, George and Emmeline were, by all accounts, well-liked by all their neighbors, eminently respectable and respected members of the community. Investigators may have initially been baffled by the apparent lack of suspects and motive in the murder of these most unlikely victims, but the residents of Graniteville were not nearly so uncertain. The small, tight-knit community immediately honed in on one suspect, and one suspect alone, Polly Houseman Bodine, Emmeline's seemingly devoted sister-in-law. As an outsider looking in, Polly appears to be an unlikely suspect. She and Emmeline had always been on close, friendly terms, with no apparent whiff of animosity or conflict between them. And baby Anne Eliza was Polly's own niece, whom she had helped raise from birth. There was also a logistical difficulty. Though medical examination concluded that the victims could have been dead as early as Christmas Eve day, the fire that was meant to conceal the crime had clearly been set late Christmas night, and Polly Bodine had an alibi for all of Christmas. She had taken the ferry early that morning and was still in Manhattan when investigators tracked her down to inform her of the tragedy on December 26th. It would be interesting to know why local suspicion concentrated so quickly and so strongly on Polly. It may be that there were secret tensions between the two women that only their intimates were aware of. But it may also have had something to do with Polly herself. You see, Polly was not what most of respectable 19th century society would consider a model of feminine virtue. When she was just 18, Polly had married Andrew Bodine, a sea captain who wound up being an abusive alcoholic and generally terrible husband. The couple soon separated, and Polly had been forced to move back into her father's house with her two children. This would have been bad enough in the minds of contemporaries, but Andrew Bodine earned further infamy when he married another woman while still being legally wed to Polly. Nor was Polly herself immune from scandal. It was well known that Polly had been carrying on a not-so-secret affair with George Waite, a Manhattan druggist who employed her 16-year-old son as a live-in apprentice. In fact, Polly's affair with Waite had resulted in several pregnancies, all of which had been terminated. In the minds of most Victorians, Polly Houseman Bodine would have been the epitome of a fallen woman. So it may be that the community was predisposed to cast her as a villain. Whatever the case, it certainly didn't help that Polly was the last known person to have seen her sister-in-law alive. But what of her alibi? She had been in Manhattan with her son and her lover George Waite all of Christmas Day, hadn't she? As it turned out, her alibi was far from airtight. While both confirmed her presence at Waite's house, her son later revealed that he had not actually seen his mother after about 4 p.m. that day. But she was still all the way in Manhattan, right? Nowhere near Staten Island. Well, maybe not. Though there was no proof of her departure from the city, a maid testified to having seen Polly Bodine on the ferry back into Manhattan early on the morning of December 26th. That same day, several items belonging to the Housemans were pawned in various shops throughout the city. All these pawnbrokers later identified the seller as Polly Bodine. A satisfactory motive was never established, but that's rarely enough to forestall an arrest. At the coroner's inquest, Polly Bodine was found guilty of the double murder. She was arrested, along with her lover, George Waite, who was suspected of being her accessory. The press went into a feeding frenzy. Salacious stories of Polly became the stock in trade of the New York tabloids, whose sales skyrocketed as the ravenous public clamored for more news of the woman the media had dubbed the Witch of Staten Island. Polly Bodine's case has been cited and very often condemned as a particularly egregious instance of trial by media. The New York Herald was blatant in its bias against her, declaring her guilty before she was even in custody. Polly herself was quick to accuse George Waite of the murders. But if the case against Polly was circumstantial, the case against George Waite was virtually non-existent. And Polly's former lover was soon quietly released without charge. Polly's trial opened on June 23, 1844. And it was a circus. There was an almost rabid public interest in the case, and extra ferry and stagecoach runs had to be organized from as far away as New Jersey to accommodate the surge of spectators who flooded into Staten Island to get a glimpse of the infamous accused murderess. The trial was plagued by problems pretty much from the get-go. In the mid-19th century, the small community on Staten Island was so interbred that both the defendant and the victims were in some way related to virtually everyone involved in the proceedings. Blood ties starkly divided the community into factions. The Housemans closed rank around Polly. Even the husband and father of the victim seemed to privilege his familial loyalty over the impartial pursuit of justice. Indeed, George Houseman shocked many when he declared, quote, "I can get another wife. I can get another child. I can never get another sister," end quote. Emmeline's family, the Van Pelts, on the other hand, were unceasing in their attacks on Polly and did everything in their power to ensure that the trial didn't go her way. With such entrenched biases and factional divides hindering the proceedings, it's hardly surprising that Polly's trial ended in a hung jury. It was decided that, quote, "in consequence of local and family interests, her second trial must be held outside of Staten Island." So the judicial circus packed up and relocated to Manhattan. Even with the location change, it was difficult to find jurors who had not been influenced by biased media coverage. Manhattanites had been following the proceedings with rapt interest and were delighted to have the courtroom drama brought to their doorstep. The courthouse saw packed, overflowing crowds every day, and the local papers covered the story with fanatic enthusiasm. During the Manhattan trial, P.T. Barnum commissioned a wax likeness of Polly for his Broadway museum. Despite the fact that Polly Bodine was actually an attractive woman in her mid-30s, Barnum's effigy portrayed her as a hideous old hag, in the midst of committing the murders, no less. The grotesque depiction only further cemented the public's negative opinion of the defendant. But that wasn't what enraged Polly about the unflattering wax effigy. In fact, her lawyers believed that their client was more outraged by Barnum's dig at her appearance than by the murder accusations. Polly's second trial was even more muddled than the first, if possible. The prosecution railed against the biased press coverage of the case. Witnesses from the first trial changed their testimonies, either forgetting details or adding others. Timelines were confused, and Polly's defense was able to poke significant holes in the prosecution's case. But it hardly mattered. Public opinion was so fiercely against Polly that the jury had little difficulty returning a guilty verdict. The defense immediately appealed the verdict to the state Supreme Court, who agreed that Polly had not received a fair hearing. A retrial was ordered. By the time of his third trial, the notoriety of the so-called Witch of Staten Island had reached such a level that over 6,000 potential jurors had to be interviewed before an unbiased panel could be assembled. After another change of venue was granted, the third trial opened in April of 1846 in Newburgh, New York. Polly's attorneys were well-seasoned pros by this time. They knew that for all the public animosity she inspired, the evidence against her was entirely circumstantial. And they managed to expertly undermine many prosecution witnesses during cross-examination. For Polly Bodine, the third time was indeed the charm. The jury at the Newburgh trial acquitted her on lack of evidence. After the not guilty verdict was read, Polly's first words to her lawyers were reportedly, quote, "Can I sue Barnum now?" With her acquittal, Polly Houseman Bodine was finally free of the law's reach. But the court of public opinion was another matter entirely. The public was enraged with the verdict and merciless in its condemnation. Though she would go on to live a long, quiet life back in Staten Island, Polly Bodine never managed to live down the notoriety that had attached itself to her. Outcast from society, she grew increasingly reclusive. She was still a social pariah when she died well into her 80s in 1892. So what do you guys think? Was Polly Bodine guilty of an unfathomably cruel, largely motiveless double murder? Or was she an ostracized woman whose perceived moral failings made her especially vulnerable to condemnation? Today, legal experts familiar with the case think there's good reason to believe that Polly was in fact guilty. Even if that is the case, the question of why continues to elude us. Why a sister, an aunt, a mother would slaughter her sister-in-law and her baby niece seemingly for no reason remains a maddening mystery. We may never know what happened that Christmas back in 1843. With the acquittal of Polly Bodine and the lack of any other viable suspect, the horrific murder of Emmeline and Anne Eliza Houseman remains unsolved to this day.